Nigel Cecil, equity as you like it.
Especially for my equitable friends. Hello, Chucker, that is Nigel Cecil here once again for my equitable friends who sent in their questions and opinions to this email address. Is that right, Hilary? Yes, and somebody mentioned that concerning the current elections, they'd seen a tweet that kind of implied that somebody else might have been involved when they weren't involved. What am I talking about, Hilary? Well, we have to probably go back some 22 years. 22 years. Is that... Nigel, Dave, equity editor here, and in my role as equity editor, I need to urge caution, because you're going back, Nigel, some 22 years in equity's history, and there'll be some in equity who won't wish to be reminded. Be careful. Dave, equity editor? Am I not allowed to go back 22 years? I mean, some have very convenient memories, forgetful when they need to forget, and remember when they need to remember. But of course, you see, somebody tweeted recently, an equity member who said... Nigel, my advice as equity editor is to remove all reference to any names. Oh, equity editor, I better not mention any names then. You know, one never knows if you're going back 22 years. But some of my equitable friends said, Nigel, why or when did equity start electing their president? And of course, many members won't be aware that until 1999, yes, 22 years or so ago, equity, the members didn't elect the president. It was done from within the council. And one member at that time, who was not too far from a democracy evangelist, suddenly thought, checking on other things, hang on a minute, equity is in breach of the law. They have to directly elect the president. Well, when you mention that to equity, at that time, and maybe some would say this time, Hilary, just went, so? So this member decided to go to the certification officer because it did seem reasonable as an evangelist for democracy to have the president elected by the whole membership. So off they went, having tried to resolve it within equity, to the certification officer. Now, some of you might say, who or what is the certification officer? Well, here's the information. The certification officer is responsible for statutory functions relating to trade unions and employers' association. And amongst their roles, they can determine complaints concerning trade union elections, certain other ballots, and certain breaches of trade union rules. So that's the role of the certification officer. Now here is where it gets a little bit complicated to understand. The certification officer usually will only take a complaint on board if the member of the trade union can demonstrate they've exhausted all the procedures within that trade union to resolve the issue. Now, if the issue has not been resolved and the member brings it to the certification officer, then the certification officer communicates that to the trade union and says, equity, would you like to respond as to why the complainant is wrong? And invariably, if the trade union failed to respond in a way that satisfies the certification officer, then the certification officer has a hearing. So realistically, the member may well be the catalyst for the hearing, but the hearing is because the trade union invariably has failed to respond to the satisfaction of the certification officer. Therefore, it is wrong and somewhat erroneous to blame the member for going to the certification officer, because everything within the trade union to resolve it has been exhausted. What happened? Well, the hearing took place and equity actually gave this undertaking at the hearing before the certification officer. The union told me at the hearing that its president had resigned the previous evening. As an equity evangelist, one would consider, therefore, that the matter was now resolved. But between that hearing and the publication by the certification officer and the next council meeting, it appears that the president had reassigned themselves. Because at that council meeting, as Moi understands it, equity had legal advice to say, well, you know, really, we don't need to abide by what we said to the certification officer, because for it to be enforced, a member would have to go to the High Court to get a ruling. And of course, that would cost the member thousands of pounds, and surely nobody would do that because they may risk not even getting their costs back. So, as far as equity concerned, done and dusted, let's carry on. We'll change the rules whenever, but the president is still the president. So what did that mean about that statement they'd made to the certification officer? The union told me at the hearing that its president had resigned the previous evening. Now, what would you expect a member who believed in democratic principles would do? Yes, they found a way of actually funding going to the High Court. And so Equity were issued with proceedings requiring them to have a hearing at the High Court. And all the way up to the door of the High Court, I think it's fair to say, is this right, Dave Equity editor, Hilary? I think, my opinion, of course, I think it's fair to say that Equity were wheeling and dealing to try and avoid everything without actually admitting they'd done anything wrong. So I think one of the things, was it Dave Equity editor? Yes, the president couldn't resign because they were on holiday in Egypt. But there you go. And so it actually got to the night before the High Court hearing, with Equity now presumably having run up thousands of pounds in costs, that Equity agreed to abide by the undertaking they'd given to the certification officer. So an agreement was drawn up and there was no need to actually proceed through the doors of the High Court. Though I understand the settlement was registered with the court. I don't know about the true ramifications and what that actually means. You know, I'm only an entertainment entrepreneur. But you see, then comes the undertaking, that mantra about keeping it all in the family. Surely a democratic evangelist wouldn't want to say to the members and in public what had actually gone on. Is that right, Dave Equity editor? The edict, let's keep it all in the family, could be used as a mantra to restrict full transparency being related to the whole of the membership. The union told me at the hearing that its president had resigned the previous evening. There you have it, Chakabatis. That statement, Equity could have abided by that statement given to the certification officer at any time, and so have avoided all the costs which were incurred simply because they didn't uphold what they'd said to the certification officer. Now, there you go. And maybe, considering those facts, that's why from 1999, Equity started electing its president by a vote of the whole membership. Now, surely that means that Evangelists for Democracy, that member involved, really should be thanked for making sure that right was given to all the members following that undertaking to the certification officer. But that wasn't reported to the membership because the truth that's the truth depends on who is relating the truth. Doesn't it, Dave Equity editor? That's correct, Nigel. You see, after all this time, I think it's fair to say that particular Equity member has been constantly denigrated by Equity because of the fallout from that, because nobody would admit equity was actually in the wrong. And of course, keeping it within the family, neither did any of the democracy evangelists want to say anything. I mean, you know, that's the way it is. But maybe now, after 22 years, and the fact that that particular member has never had one good thing in those 22 years printed about them by Equity officially, well, maybe an apology might be due, just to demonstrate that Equity now are determined to uphold democratic principles on behalf of all the members. So with that in mind, I hope you voted in the current elections, though I suspect, looking at the profiles on Twitter and everything, that's not going to happen. So what do we do about democracy within Equity? Well, stay tuned to Nigel Cecil, moi, an entertainment entrepreneur, and see what we come up with next. Happy voting!
Nigel Cecil, Equity as you like it.